Danielle Smith for Common Sense Calgary. We are interviewing the candidates for the upcoming civic election in the fall for Calgary City Council. And a familiar face joins me now, your candidate for Ward 10, Andre Chabot. Andre, nice to see you.
Same. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, the first question people are going to be asking is, what have you been doing the last 4 years?
Well, I've been out in the private sector, kind of on the other side of the table, doing a little bit of planning consulting. And, you know, I'm a carpenter by trade, so doing a little bit of dabbling in carpentry. I'm a jack of all trades, so even doing a little mechanical work.
So I know that you wanted to be mayor last time around. What made you decide that you wanted to jump back in on city council?
Well, I've been watching things a little bit, and having been involved in the private sector and seeing the struggles that the small businesses are facing, especially in the outlying areas, I couldn't help but think there's got to be something more that can be done on city council. And watching some of the things that have happened over the last three plus years, I'm thinking, yeah, they could have benefited from my experience, especially my vast understanding of the city's budget. And some adjustments could have been made to lessen the impact on small businesses, especially in outlying areas.
So let's talk particularly about the incumbent who was. He resigned early, Ray Jones. Is there certain things that certain decisions he made in the last 4 years that you would have done differently?
Well, I haven't been tracking it that closely, but I can tell you one thing for sure, that when we had that major snowfall in the winter, I would have been pretty quick at reacting on that and saying, listen, we've got what's referred to as the rainy day fund, the fiscal stability reserve. Let's draw on that immediately and hire in private contractors to come in and clear some of these residential streets so people can actually get out and get to work. I think council was really slow at reacting on that issue. In fact, almost negligibly. And so I think that's one thing that I would have done, and used some of that fiscal stability reserve to take action right away to clear the streets so people could actually get to work.
Well, you know better than anyone because you've been there. You were there for a number of years. I think 12 years in total on council. What do you think happened this time? Was it straight up a funding issue? Is it a management issue? Is it a delay issue? Is it that they're not contracting out independent contractors? What do you think happened there?
No, it's well, they've got a fixed budget, and there was some money, some contingency put aside that was supposed to be utilized, like an extra 10 million once every 3 years, or within that 3-year time frame. And I think they had exhausted most of those resources, and so they were hesitant about going back to the well to draw more water from it, essentially. But the fiscal stability reserve, as you know, has been supplemented through positive variances in the budget. And typically the city under budgets their revenue, and quite excessively, actually, in fact, in the last 5 or 6 years, to the tune of about $90 million a year. So, you know, that budget, they keep saying, oh, we got to be careful, we don't draw it down too much because there won't be enough left, because we have to be within 5 to 10% of our gross budget to meet standards and poors. Yeah, okay, but when you keep adding like $90 million a year to it, you got to draw it down quite a bit before you enter into those scary positions, financial positions.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you're the first person who has mentioned that. I've spoken with Marcel Latouche from the Institute for Public Sector Accountability about that issue for literally decades. He first told me about it in the 90s, that there's an over budgeting. So they overestimate their expenses, underestimate their revenues, and they always generate surpluses each year. So why can't that get addressed? You know that it's a problem. Why is that so difficult to solve?
You know, we were actually addressing it when I was on council, except for the last 2 years when Jeff Fielding was there. And I think he saw that there wasn't enough additional revenue generated, because what we were projecting for revenue, even though they were still under projecting it, was too close, in his opinion, to what the final number was. The variance was only between 25 and 30 million. But the last 2 years before Jeff Fielding left, that's when he bumped it up to a 90 million plus. And the city also puts in a $35 million contingency for appeals to property tax, property taxes. And again, we could draw on Edmonton's experience on how to mitigate the number of appeals that we get. They have a better solution. And don't ask me what that solution is. All I can tell you is that I've spoken to some people in the assessment review board, and they said, yeah, we could actually follow Edmonton's model and have fewer appeals. So,
well, you've sort of raised a different approach then for how you might address the issue of spending versus tax cuts. I'm almost hearing from you that we're doing that. If you just budgeted properly, you might be able to bring your spending in line without having to increase taxes.
yeah, and there's a whole bunch of other things too, like some of the reserves, like there's the Elmer Reserve Life Cycle Maintenance Upgrade and Replacement Reserve. There's a Pay-as-you-go reserve. There's another reserve, I can't remember what it's called now, but it was used to fund some of the rec centers as well as the library. And not to mention, of course, the $52 million a year that's going directly towards the Green Line. Well, that $52 million a year has been going into that reserve for the Green Line for the last, 11 years now? And so there's I don't know, where has that money been spent? Or has it been spent? Or is it actually been kept in a reserve and it's drawing interest specifically for funding the Green Line? Whereas any other reserves typically goes into financing and it gets invested, and so that generates revenue for the city of Calgary, interest revenue. But some of the capital programs include a lot of mill rate dollars, property tax dollars to help to fund those programs. So what I would suggest, first and foremost, is delay some of those capital expenditures, not cancel, but delay some of those capital expenditures, push them out, and use some of those mill rate dollars, property tax dollars, to lessen the burden that we're currently facing because of the economic challenges that we face as a city, especially to small businesses in outlying areas.
So let's talk about some of the delays of capital projects you would propose. So first of all, the Green Line. As you know, Rick McIver, the transportation minister, has said he doesn't like the project as it's currently devised because it doesn't connect in with the existing LRT system. It was supposed to go deep north, east, south, and it only sort of bridges the downtown core. So it doesn't really service either community, and it's going to cost more and only be half the size. So what would you do to solve that problem?
Right from the get-go, Danielle, I said scope creep will double the price of this project. And everyone on council was like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. There's not going to be scope creep. I said, listen, I've got personal experience on the west leg of the LRT. It was supposed to originally cost $700 million, ended up costing $1.4 billion. I said, so you know what? Members of council can't help themselves but to say, you know what? It would be better if it was this way. And so it's political interference that ultimately ended up increasing the cost of this project. So what I would have done differently is, first of all, I wouldn't have accepted administration's initial assessment on the cost because it was all predicated on at grade. Well, how can you do at grade, especially if you're going over top of the river? Like, what is the actual cost of going over the river or under the river? Like I say, the initial assessment, in my opinion, was incorrect, and I suspect that they had anticipated that they were going to run the LRT up an existing bridge structure to go up north, as opposed to creating a new right of way specifically for the LRT, because there's no other way that they could have come up with an assessment of only 5-point-something billion dollars for that full line.
So the strong indication that I think I'm getting from the transportation minister is build it so it connects somewhere. Don't just build it to nowhere. What would your, I mean, you know what the potential connections are and some of the challenges downtown. Is there a solution you can put forward? Well,
I think what was initially proposed was a line to go all the way down south, all the way down to South Seaton. And of course, there's some very significant challenges, mobility challenges to go down south. To the South Health campus, and the initial assessment was to look at putting in BRT all the way to the hospital. The North Central line, don't get me wrong, those folks would probably rather go on to a light rail transit than the bus system. But our most successful bus system in the entire city is the one that goes up North Central part of the city. It moves between 35 to 40 million people a day. This is bus. So it's not really broken. What is it we're trying to fix here? Whereas down south, the amount of time that could be saved by going to the South Health campus with a dedicated right-of-way transit service, whether that's BRT or LRT, that could benefit significantly. You would get a good return on investment because the transit system is supposed to be 50-50 supported by taxpayers and by the fare box. In other words, how much you collect for people to actually ride the system. Well, because of the huge decline in ridership, that mix now is probably closer to 80-20, 80% of the transit system being supported by property taxes and only 20% of it being paid for by people actually using the transit system.
Yeah.
So you beware of capital expenditures that have operational implications.
Now you have me
Make
worried
sure-
about. Now you have me worried about the other 4 capital expenditures that the city put forward, and or that the council approved. But even the CFO said you can't afford all 4 of these at the time. We're talking about the event center with the Calgary Flames, the BMO center expansion for convention space, the Foothills Fieldhouse, and the Arts Commons. So you've already talked about delaying capital projects. Tell us if there was one of those projects that you would have put it as the priority, what would it have been?
Probably the Green Line. Sorry,
Oh,
you didn't
really?
even include the Green Line in that. But yeah, I think that one, because it will reduce, ultimately it can reduce congestion going down south. It can get people off the road, especially if people can see that the LRT is going by them while they're sitting in their car in a traffic jam. You might encourage more people to actually take the transit system.
So you wouldn't do any of those other projects at the
Well,
moment?
I think there was way too much money left on the table, to be honest, on the new rink, whatever you want to call it, Saddle Dome, or the new Flames Central Calgary Sports and Entertainment Facility, because it was all predicated on that it will stimulate redevelopment in that area, and there's no evidence to support those assertions that were made. And so the timeline for cost recovery by foregoing tax revenue for the next 30 years, I think it's going to have to be extended. And if you look at the current Saddle Dome, in my lifetime, and I'm dating myself here, but back in the 80s, I actually worked on that Saddle Dome. I helped to build it. So within my own lifetime, I not only helped to build something, but now ultimately we'll see it getting torn down. So if we're building something, we want to build legacies that will last hopefully beyond 30 some plus years. And in this case, it'll have to, because at the end of that 30 years, in my opinion, it still won't be paid for.
All right. Let me turn it to your ward, though. Any particular issues that you're hearing at the door that constituents are raising with you? What are the 3 big issues in Ward 10?
I would say in the Northeast, the biggest concerns from people is that they don't believe that City Council is making effective use of their tax dollars. And so I guess, having a good understanding of the city's budget, I know that I could ensure that those property tax dollars are well utilized. And the some of the other concerns are policing. They feel that maybe we could have more safety and security, not defunding the police, if anything, increase the police presence. The concept of defunding the police to me is kind of strange. Listen, I get the idea of putting more funding into support services, into social services, especially on some of those calls that could have the benefit of having a social worker involved in the call, as well as police, because sometimes even things like domestic disputes can become violent, and you don't want to make sure that everyone is safe. But the concept of taking money out of the police budget to fund some of these other programs that are typically a provincial responsibility, to me, is just, it's wrong. Property tax dollars should be used for core municipal services. If we're going to start looking at increasing other services, which don't get me wrong, I think it's a great idea, but let's go to the source that's responsible for funding that, and not take it from Calgary taxpayers. Take it from other revenue, royalty revenue, or something that the province ultimately is responsible for.
All right. Let me ask you a couple of questions about because you understand the budget. One of the things that I think we've observed over the last number of years is an increase in wages for frontline staff, wages, benefits, pension. Why is that such a difficult issue to get a handle on? Are you able to give some insights about how you might approach negotiations differently?
Well, I would say, first and foremost, city council should take a lead. And I've said this many times. I tried to propose this numerous times as a member of council to freeze council's pay increases. And everyone likes, well, this is not going to have any impact on our budget. I go, you're absolutely right. City council's, salaries are such a minuscule portion of our overall budget. But you take into consideration that a 1% increase in union salaries equates to about a 1.5% increase in property taxes. So, you start adding that cumulatively over a 4-year time frame, all of a sudden that's a pretty significant tax increase. And right now, I think the world, not just Calgary, Alberta in particular, but the whole world is experiencing some economic challenges. And us primarily because we're focused a lot on the energy sector, and there's been such a huge drop in energy prices that we are more impacted maybe than other areas. So for us, I think it's even more critically important that we manage those dollars more effectively.
Let's talk about that. You just sort of referenced it, but people are talking about the issue of the tax shift. And I think we've seen 2 tax shifts. We've seen a lot of reliance on downtown businesses to fund the city of Calgary budget over the years. And then when that hollowed out, that money got shifted over to the business community in the Beltline area and other outlying areas. And some of those businesses just got walloped. And now there's a proposal to shift a portion of it onto residential. Do you support that move?
Our residential property taxes are typically lower than most other cities, but you start looking at things like user fees, and all of a sudden we're not that far off anymore. Something is that essential services should be something that comes out of everybody's property tax bill. But when you start adding it as a user fee, things that are essential like garbage collection, blue cart, green cart, then you are disproportionately sharing the tax collected to benefit those people that are more affluent, to the detriment of those people who are less affluent. And what I mean by that is, like, if I have to pay $100 a year and I live in the outlying areas for collection of garbage, as an example, to me, if I compare that to my municipal property taxes, say it's about $1,000 a year for my municipal portion, that represents a 10% tax increase. But somebody who lives in a downtown core, $100 a year increase to their current, $20,000 a year property tax bill is nothing. It's a 0%, a 0.01% increase. Now, because it's an essential service, and all services are like that, whether it's parks maintenance or road maintenance, fire department, police department, all of those things are essential services, and they come out of individual's properties taxes based on your property value. So it's a percentage of your taxes. So why is it that garbage, blue cart, and green cart is treated separately as a user fee when it's a mandatory service? Okay. It should be part of the mill rate, which would represent only about a 1.5% tax increase to the people in the outlying areas. But it could be a more significant dollar amount to the people in the inner city, but it would still be a 1.5% tax increase, as opposed to a 20% tax increase for the people in the outlying areas.
So I take your point that you want to have more services covered under the mill rate, but you still have businesses that are paying 4 times as much as residents are, and they have to pay their own garbage collection too. They don't get the same services. So what would you do about the burden on the business community?
Yeah, well, see, so if we went back to an essential service covered through the mill rate, then it would actually reduce the taxes on, especially on people in the outlying areas, that we could then transition some of that non-residential tax burden onto the residential without increasing their taxes.
Hmm.
Of course, you would have people in the more affluent communities paying more in property taxes, maybe a higher percentage than people in the outlying areas. But ultimately, you get what you pay for. You want to live in a $5 million home. You expect that you're going to be paying, higher taxes than somebody who lives in a $400,000 home.
Okay. So
Isn't the burden on some of the small businesses, and many of those people who live in those more affluent communities actually own some of the small businesses, and so it's from one hand or one pocket to the other, I guess you could say, but ultimately lessening the burden on small businesses and making everyone pay their fair share based on what your property value is worth. And so we could actually shift some of that non-residential tax burden to the residential tax burden without actually increasing their taxes significantly.
I have a suspicion I know how you're going to fall on this next question based on what you've just said, but what about the idea of bringing in new taxes? You've watched it over the years. There's always, whether it's a city charter proposal or a proposal coming from one of the municipal bodies, or whether it was the report last year, would you support new tax powers?
No.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward. Like there's other ways that we can utilize the existing revenue streams to maybe delay some projects and not cancel anything, but delay some of the projects to lessen the load now while times are tough. And when things pick up, then we can start looking at repurposing or reallocating some of those funding sources to fund some of those projects or accelerate some of those projects if the revenues do start picking up, especially if we start filling up the downtown core again with businesses and not with residential, because that just further exacerbates the whole issue around the non-residential shifting to the outlying areas. If you switch it to residential, you lose that non-residential component.
It's a good point. So tell me how you would go about doing that. The latest numbers I saw is that there's enough vacancy downtown that you could accommodate 100 to 140,000 employees. How do you get those office towers filled again with employees?
Well, I guess you could offer some tax incentives to encourage more businesses to move into the area by possibly giving them a tax holiday, if you will. Council has the authority to forego taxes for a certain period of time for those businesses. If we're not collecting a significant amount of tax dollars out of those large buildings anyways, at least limit the increase, because right now the assessed value on those properties is a function of their vacancy. Because vacancy is so high, it has decreased the value of those properties so much so that it's pushed all of that tax burden to the outlying areas. So if you could say, okay, listen, if you move into this building, we will not increase your taxes for the next 6 months. So essentially you will get a tax savings for the next 6 months to incentivize people to move into the area, because those taxes are quite significant on some of those larger buildings. And then you will recoup that loss revenue over time, even if you did it for 1 year, because typically we don't budget for 1 year. City's operating budget is a 4-year budget. The capital budget's a 5-year budget. And so we can make adjustments over the course of that, but typically we are projecting out at least 4 years. So don't look at it so myopically as to what is it going to do for me today. Look at what is it going to do for me in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now.
All right. Let me ask you just on another business issue, because as you know, development issues are really one of the core things that council members have to deal with. And there seems to have been a tension with the development community over the last couple of terms. I'm wondering if you want to comment on that, but more specifically, it does seem like there's this battle going on between, do you densify and build up, or do you allow new greenfield development and grow out? And I think both of them are trying to get at an issue of affordability, wanting to make sure that there are new homes for that first-time home buyer in a single-family home. Often they want to go to the suburbs. But you can also increase affordability by having multifamily homes in some of the communities where there's existing infrastructure. So where do you fall on that issue?
Well, it's a fine balance, to be honest with you. And so if you look at the way the city has developed over the last 100 years, some of the older established communities are the true definition of sprawl. And so when we talk about sprawl and limiting sprawl, we're actually talking about existing developed communities. Because if you look at any of the new communities, they've all been designed around planning principles to ensure that they are self-sustaining or as close to self-sustaining as possible. So the idea of we got to stop growing out, well, that idea has been mitigated by virtue of new planning principles that council has already adopted. So the sprawl is not what it used to be. People say, oh, you can't keep growing out because it's unsustainable. Well, the truth is those outlying communities are way more sustainable than current existing developed communities. So
Okay.
you're absolutely correct.
So let me then let me then, sorry, I think there's just a little bit of a delay. So I'm sorry if I keep talking over you. Let me ask you then about the guidebook to great communities, because that created a lot of furor at council. You may have seen some of the news stories on it. It does come down to this, that the older districts like the communities that they have. They like the larger yards. And I think there's some concern that densification is going to happen in the wrong places. So what have you heard from your constituents, and how would you address it?
Well, I've been pretty involved in communicating this with several community members across the entire city. So I have a fairly good understanding of the concerns. This hasn't been well communicated out to the outlying areas. So the folks in my communities who are not currently directly involved, but will be by virtue of these recent changes that occurred in January, where they've created these zones A, zone B, center city. Those zones, which are sort of targeted area for densification, is just been a last minute addition to this guidebook that no one was aware of until January of this year. And that hasn't been well communicated out. And what's lacking in this document as compared to the previous version, which was adopted when I was chairman of Planning and Urban Development, which was the Developed Area Guidebook. It's a 69-page document. So to suggest that there is no guiding document is not actually factually correct. There is a guiding document. Now, whether or not it's effective enough is another question, but it was way more focused around sensitive intensification. This new guidebook lacks that sensitivity, and that's the biggest concern that people have, is that it doesn't have that same level of sensitivity, and it provides a much greater certainty for developers than it does for the residents. And most residents, I think, recognize the need to increase density in their neighborhoods to make them more sustainable, but they want to make sure that it's limited to certain portions, because neighborhood connector, neighborhood flex, those definitions are so broad and could encompass an entire street, as opposed to focusing it in key high activity type centers or areas. The fact that it can occur along an entire block face is what most community folks are concerned about.
I get it. Let me ask you about the issue of fire, because I think it's connected to this topic as well, and I thought you might have some insights on it. One of the things that we heard about why new communities, I think there were a proposal for 10 new suburban developments that was put on pause, is the notion that there isn't enough money to pay for new development of fire halls and the staffing associated with that. It strikes me there should be a better way. Based on what you said, if you're building these communities with good planning principles, and so building new communities makes sense, why can't they be built with that kind of essential infrastructure? What am I missing?
Well, it's not the capital cost, because that typically is dealt with in a different manner. It's the operating costs associated with a fire hall. I think operating cost is somewhere around $3 to $3.5 million a year for each fire hall, and the issue becomes, how long is it going to take to have enough development in the area to pay even just for that operating cost? This goes back to what I said before. Beware of capital expenditures because of the operational implications of those capital expenditures. Now, that's not to suggest that some developers couldn't help to subsidize the operating costs for some of those new fire halls until such time as build out achieves the ultimate goal of being self-sustaining. Now, the city of Calgary has pretty significant resources at its disposal, quite a bit of money in reserves that they could utilize to buffer the burden, if you will, and then reimburse some of those developers the money that they laid out until such time as they became self-sustaining. And so you could say, okay, you know what? For the next 5 years, you guys are going to have to subsidize the operating cost of this facility. But 5 years after that, we will reimburse you whatever you paid into the system initially, because we will now have enough return on investment, if you will, to pay you back those those funds that you put out. It's kind of like an endeavor to assist or sort of capital finance agreements that the city currently enters into for infrastructure. Well, why just use that method for capital? Use it for operating as well.
Interesting. Okay, let me ask you about EMS, because I think that was sold by the province as a way of saving money, but the city was not in favor of centralized dispatch. Do you have a position on that?
Yeah, well, I was, of course, on council when this was proposed many years ago, and we saw this as not necessarily saving money, but then it's not transparent, the process. It's just like the EMS service itself. When the province recognized that emergency medical services, not 911, but just EMS itself, the ambulances, the city used to run that. And then they said, okay, you know what, you're right, it's healthcare, it's our responsibility, we will take it over. But in the interim, here's $25 million a year for you to continue to operate it until such time as we were ready to take it over. And Iris Evans was the minister at the time. And I said, well, Ms. Evans, with all due respect, it's costing us $28 million a year to deliver the service. You're short $3 million a year. It's like, oh, no, we think that's wrong. We think that's wrong. Well, I mean, I'd be really interested to see how much it's costing them now, but I guarantee you it's more than double what the city was paying. So the question is, with the province saying, oh yeah, we're going to save a bunch of money by taking over this 911 response emergency through EMS. First of all, it's not saving time, it's adding time. So it's putting more people's lives at risk, because seconds can mean the difference between life and death, especially in a case of a stroke or a heart attack. And is it truly saving money? Well, I don't know if it's saving money. And it may today, but will it tomorrow?
Yeah, thanks for that history lesson. I mean, you have to wonder whether they make the wrong decision in the first step that took us to this path, but we'll talk more about that another day. Let me ask about public art, because there've been a few black eyes for the city of Calgary, the Big Blue Ring, the Beaufort Towers. Do you think that they've now resolved the way public art is chosen, or would you take a different approach?
Again, I don't think there's very much oversight from the city of Calgary City Council is concerned. Still, a lot of it is being handled, externally. So a lot of decisions are made in the absence of council's input or, weighing in on those decisions. I think ultimately there should be at least one member of council sitting on a committee that makes those decisions, and possibly even two. That's like subdivision development appeal board. Everyone's like, oh, council should not be involved in those appeals. But you know what? It is such a great learning tool and a great way for members of council to become aware of the implications of some of their planning policies and principles that they put into place and how it's now dealt with after the fact. Because if all you do is you push, this is our policy, this is our agenda, and you don't know what the repercussions are of making those changes, you can continue to go on blindly doing things incorrectly without knowing what the potential implications of those things are. So I think some of those things, like public art, like subdivision development appeal board, members of council could definitely benefit, and council as a whole, by having individuals on council sitting on those committees to provide feedback to the rest of council and say, you know what, we did this, but it's not working so well. We need to fix it. Here's how we propose, the group that I represent or the group that I sit on, suggests that we fix the legislation to be better. So public art is just one.
Yeah, so let's stay with this theme of sort of figuring out what the proper role of council is. And there's a couple of referenda being proposed for the fall. They said yes to one and no to the other. Just give me your basic take on things. Do you think that you're elected to make all decisions, or do you think that there are some decisions that should go to the people directly?
I think we can always benefit from public input. Whether or not that influences our ultimate decision, I think members of council are elected to make decisions in the best interest of Calgarians based on all of the input. And that includes public engagement on people's opinions. Sometimes it's challenging to try and educate the entire public on all of the little nuances on some decisions. But I would hope that our elected officials take the time to do their due diligence and do their homework to actually truly make a decision that's in the best interest of all Calgarians. And I, for one, can say that I think everyone who's ever had to deal with me on council or in administration will say to you that, yeah, no one's ever questioned whether or not I did my homework.
So do you think the referenda on fluoride should not happen? Do you think council should have made that decision?
Well, council has made that decision. And I don't necessarily oppose the idea of getting public input. The issue is it's such a complex matter, and there's so much information on both sides of that issue that it's going to be very challenging to try and inform the vast majority of people on that. I would say speed limits would be a much easier thing to explain to the general public to go to a referendum than fluoride.
All right, let me just do one last one then, because you've had to deal with this balance before where city administration may recommend something that is of benefit, they say, to the city as a whole, but your own constituents in your own ward want you to vote differently. How do you balance that?
Yeah, that's so I go back to an old Star Trek episode. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so there are some instances where if I see that the benefit for the majority is so significant and the detriment to the people that I represent is so minimal, and that's sort of the balance that I try and play. If I don't see that it's going to have a huge negative impact on the people that I represent, then I tend to support those initiatives. But if I see something that may ultimately benefit the city as a whole, but it's going to have a huge detriment to the people that I represent, I'm sorry, I'm going to be ward-centric on those decisions and vote with the people who put me here.
All right.
If every member of council did that, then ultimately we would get a democracy of the city as a whole representing the interests of the city.
All right.
In my opinion. I think that's how democracy is supposed to work.
Andre Chabot, it's a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
You got it. That's your Ward 10 candidate, Andre Chabot.
Thanks.